Hello and welcome to the Raisina 2020 Dialogues. I'm really pleased to be with you here today to discuss trends of radicalization across Europe. Why is it happening? What are we seeing? How can we solve for this from different sectors? I'm Erин Saltman. I'm on the Facebook Counterterrorism and Dangerous Organizations team, and I'm really pleased to have two amazing experts with me here today. We have Рафаело Пантучи from the Royal United Services Institute, who is the Senior Associate Fellow there, and we also are joined by Marија Ристеска, who is both the founder and Executive Director of the Center for Research and Policy Making in Macedonia. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for inviting me.
So let's dive right in. What are we seeing as the main trends in violent extremism and radicalization in Europe, and how much are these hyper-localized incidents, or do we see it really connected to global?
So, I mean, I would say that there's been an incredible diffusion of terrorist ideologies and terrorist methodologies over the past few years in Europe, and this reflects a kind of global trend where we've had, a terrorist organization which seemed to be very structured, very directed from one place to launch attacks in other places, to being something which have an ideology that's sort of scattered to the winds and is picked up in all sorts of different places. And this has led to a sort of an incredible diffusion of these ideologies and of the threat that we're seeing in Europe in particular, but I think globally. I think at the same time as that, we do still see a fairly consistent problem of links between problems in other parts of the world, like South Asia that we're seeing now, and the threat picture that we see emerging in parts of Europe, where we do see a sort of direct corollary between issues emerging here and how they link up to the problems we have in the United Kingdom. The attacker we saw at the end of last year in London, on London Bridge, was a young man who was clearly quite animated by what was happening in Kashmir, was ultimately buried there, and in a previous iteration had been trying to build a terrorist camp in Kashmir. So we still do have that kind of link between the two. And then the final thing I wanted to briefly touch on is an interesting phenomenon that we've seen, which is a growing instance of individuals with mental health problems or social disorders showing up as part of the terrorist threat picture. And this is something that's really complicating the response from our security forces, because they're no longer just dealing with a sort of very cold and calculating group, but you're dealing with a very confused group, where people seem to be latching onto ideologies in a way to express some other problem in their lives.
And I know that you've written about this as well, the difference between maybe group joiners versus lone actors and the higher rate of mental health issues that come up with these lone actors. Marија, what are some of the trends that your institute is seeing when you look at especially young individuals that are perhaps undergoing a process of radicalization?
I would say that the main factors are the failure of the multiculturalism project and the crisis of representative democracy, which actually affects on the creation of the problem of identity among young people who are trying to seek for recognition. They are on individual level feeling discriminated, they are alienated, and they are not included. And that's why they are seeking for adopting rather radical ideologies.
And obviously, I know a lot of the literature around this talks about identity and social cohesion. What is somebody's in-group? How do they define themselves? We're kind of talking about this as if we know what we're saying when we say terrorism or violent extremism, but in Europe, what are the ideologies that are currently prone to violent extremism? I know we talk a lot and for Islamist extremist radicalization when we talk about the so-called Islamic State, but are we seeing other types of violent extremism that are plaguing Europe right now?
So I think the sort of big emergent story that we've seen over the past few years, but actually isn't really that new, is the extreme right wing. We talk a lot now about the extreme right wing as a sort of major threat. We've seen a number of countries put a lot more resource towards this, and I think we've seen a shift in patterns in the extreme right wing, whereas previously it used to be very sort of isolated individuals. We are starting to see networks emerge. We are starting to see some sort of coordination. We are seeing links to foreign battlefields. So we're starting to see something taking shape, which seems to be the very far edge of a political spectrum, but has a kind of violent edge to it, which is becoming a dominant problem that we're seeing a lot of countries sort of worrying about. But I think the other one, which I think is particularly interesting and is more emergent, is we're seeing these sort of micro-ideologies emerge, these strange ideas which seem to be, a few isolated individuals will have an obsession that they will talk about somewhere, maybe online, and this will develop into an ideology which they decide to try to take forwards. And these micro-ideologies have a sort of shade of the bigger terrorist ideologies that we think about, but at the same time are really only the preserve of isolated individuals. And I think it's very difficult, it's becoming increasingly difficult to separate the two out, because they look so similar in how they articulate themselves and the problems that they express. And in some cases, the attacks that we see as a result of them, it's really starting to make it very difficult for governments to be able to separate out, some of these micro-ideologies from some of the larger ideologies, which are still the sort of classic ones that we've always worried about.
And what are some examples of those micro-ideologies?
I think the incel movement, this sort of group of people who are sort of, involuntary celibates, was one particular articulation. If we look at some of the school shooters that have emerged in parts of Europe, they're aping the sort of school shootings that we've seen in the United States, but adding a kind of weird political spin of their own. If we look at some of the extreme right wing, some of it is the kind of classic extreme right wing worshipping Hitler and doing these other things, but others are going in very odd directions that are sort of blending weird Christian ideologies with a sort of classic extreme right wing, and it's going in a direction which is very hard to sort of completely trace.
Mm. And what are you seeing, Maria, in Macedonia or in some of the region around you? Does this mimic some of the same trends that Рафаело is seeing, or is it quite consolidated?
Well, we can analyze it on a macro level. Probably people are dissatisfied. There are grievances on the global injustices from socioeconomic reasons or other political reasons. We see political ideologies emerging on the right and on the left spectrum. And of course, being from a country which is very polarized, the religious polarization between the Orthodox and the Muslims in the Balkans and in Europe, I think, is going to be trending further on in the future.
I wonder if I could just add on to that, because I think the point that you make around some of those issues between Orthodox and Muslim clashes, those are long-standing historical issues, aren't they, in that part of the world?
They are.
This is one of the really key things that I think we often forget with these ideologies, is they've got a very long tail and a very long history. I mean, the extreme right wing is not new to Europe.
Right.
We don't talk a lot about the extreme left, but there are still leftist groups that are launching bombing campaigns in parts of Greece, in parts of Italy. These are ideologies which have been around for a very long time, and I think that is one of the things that we often forget when we talk about some of these terrorist ideologies, as though they're new. I mean, these are not new things. They tend to have a very long tail that goes back. And in some way, that, I think, is what gives them such substance and gives them such ability to sort of redevelop and grow and pick up on sort of current themes.
And so you both mentioned some of the more fringe ideologies, as well as some of these long-standing historical ties that even the fringe ideologies are perhaps playing upon. We've seen attacks in Christchurch, New Zealand, Halle, Germany, as well as Poway, San Diego, that were more white supremacist extreme right-wing attacks, but we still are looking at the long-going Islamist extremist threat from groups like the so-called Islamic State. So what are the main factors of radicalization? How can we then think to even prevent or cause resiliency? You mentioned disillusionment and perhaps maybe identity crises, but there's lots of disillusioned people, lots of people with identity crisis, and the vast majority of those people are not going to become violent extremists. So what are some of the other factors that are playing into, especially in Europe, this radicalizing factor? Is it the branding of these groups? Is it that they don't see themselves in other forms of politics? What are we thinking?
I think there is a big crisis of representative democracy across Europe and in the Balkans, where I come from, and this is the main factor that is making people feel unrepresented, unrecognized, and they decide to realize their grievances either through violence or through democracy. They have really hard time realizing through democracy because of the rather clientelistic and political systems that we have set up in Europe. And finally, they can realize it through internet. All these groups that have different forms of grievances cannot physically unite, but on internet they can unite. And this is, I think, the biggest future threat of violent extremism, that they will unite and use technology to attack critical infrastructure, which is most vulnerable and for which we do not have responses, united responses, because all these networks are pan-national and are, can use internet as a platform.
I think that there is there's sort of a number of things. I think one thing to think about is the point of radicalization. I mean, you know, reams of literature that I know you've both, I'm sure, read and we've all seen about how radicalization works and all the individual processes. And one of the big things that comes out of all of them is that it's a very individual process. There is no uniform kind of thing that we can say, this is radicalization, this is, you look at that in every context and exactly the same, because, as you very correctly point out, there are people who fit all of the criteria of being individuals who should be moving towards radicalization, and yet they don't. Instead, they go off into something else, or, you know, they move on with their lives. So it's very difficult, I think, to pin it down entirely. But I think what's interesting is now the fact that, and I think to some degree, social media and the internet and the way we're all connected has exacerbated this, is the fact that now you have got isolated individuals who previously wouldn't really have been able to participate in the group activity that constitutes a kind of terrorist network, can now connect with other people, you know, through social media and through their online connections, and through that feel that they're part of a group, and then feel that they're part of a group that they should do some action in the real world, which previously, you know, if they tried to join that group would have frankly pushed them away because they said, you know, this person's, you know, crazy, or we can't deal with him, or we can't communicate with him. But now, through the anonymity that's provided with this sort of online communication, they can actually feel that they're really part of that group and actually act on that impulse. And I think that is a very interesting new development that we're seeing. I think the other point, I think you alluded to your question, thinking about the extreme right wing versus violent Islamists, and, you know, maybe we still do focus on violent Islamists as a more sort of dangerous threat, even though some of the big attacks we've seen recently have been on the extreme right wing. The extreme right wing still seems quite sporadic. The attacks that we see are still isolated individuals who are kind of black swan events, whereas the kind of big strategic threat of a group trying to mobilize a network to launch a very big attack on the scale of what we saw in Paris or in London or in Madrid, that still comes very much from the kind of violent Islamist end of the scale. So there is still a difference, I think, in the threat picture between those two different ideologies. The absolute final point I'd like to make on this would be this question of what I think about as sort of performative violence, which I think is becoming an increasingly big aspect of how terrorism is articulating itself these days. Whereas, you know, people see that the act of mass violence performed by the individual on behalf of an ideology is seemingly a way of articulating an anger against society. It's often very incoherently linked to an ideology, but that kind of gets lost in the subsequent discussion that we see. But I think that is a very interesting development that we've seen recently, which again has confused our understanding of what actually is a very terrorist ideology and the individual actors who are seemingly acting on behalf of it.
So you both brought up the role of tech within this, and obviously as somebody that works on counterterrorism at Facebook, we shouldn't avoid or shy away from this, but we also know that terrorism does predate the internet, and there's a lot of interplay between the online and the offline. We also talked a little bit in our coffee beforehand about, you know, the fact that nobody has just one app on their phone. So something might take place on Facebook and Telegram and Twitch, and we see a diversification of platforms. So with this in mind, recognizing that maybe I can remove accounts, use artificial intelligence, find certain networks just on my platform, how do you think we go forward from this perhaps doom and gloom narrative towards either creating resiliency using online and offline, but also creating mechanisms for disengagement? So what do we do once somebody has gone down a process of radicalization? How do we move them back towards the non-violent and less extreme side of the spectrum? What's the wish list going forward?
Well, I think that all of the countries have similar interventions in this regards. They are all either working on building community resilience towards violent extremism, focusing mainly on the youth and using tools like critical thinking and media literacy and so on. But we see national approaches being applied, not pan-national approaches. And I think here the role of the European Union should be crucial. Not having or having an absence of European joint policy on tackling these issues, especially the issue of reintegration of foreign fighters in societies from where these foreign fighters went to Syria, is very important, because as we know and we've mentioned, these networks are pan-national, and with the European policies in place of free movement of people and goods, also their actions will move around, and we need a joint policy on all these issues. So I think that in the future we should focus more on continental approach of violent extremism rather than putting it into national frameworks.
Great.
I mean, very briefly, I think on the tech side, I think there is clearly, tech is clearly one of the big aspects that we see a lot of these groups using. As we sort of mentioned, I think companies clearly are doing a lot. I think that they struggle because these are global issues and you're often national companies and legislation doesn't always harmonize. But maybe companies should use that sort of global platform that they have to try to get more people to sort of harmonize and work together. I think the other side of the question is that these problems, and I think this speaks to the rehabilitation point, is that you're dealing with increasing a cohort of people who have stayed engaged in these ideas for a very long period of time. And I think that is clearly where the rehabilitation needs to focus. And remember that this is not a problem which will get solved in one election cycle. It will take a very long time, and the resources need to be dedicated both online and offline in a very long-term projection in mind.
So I think the main takeaways from this is that we need a multinational approach, that we cannot bucket into country by country silos, that we actually need time and resources, perhaps both from government and private institutes such as Facebook and others, and that we should have a multi-sector approach so that we can collaborate. And I know that, for example, RUSI was part of the Global Research Network on Terrorism. The Global Internet Forum to Counter Terrorism has a global research network on terrorism and technology, so your expertise is needed. So anyone out there watching that is coming from an academic, legislative, policy, or tech sector perspective, definitely get in touch with us. Your expertise is needed in this film. Thank you so much for joining us here for the Raisina Dialogues for 2020 in this Facebook Live studio. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Pleasure was ours.